It was just another busy Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago. The spring sun was beating down on the bustling streets as 12-year-old Sarah made her way to the corner store to pick up some milk for her grandmother. She had walked this route hundreds of times before, but today would be different. Today would be the day that a simple act of kindness would change not just her life, but someone else's too. As she approached the intersection of State and Madison, she noticed a well-dressed man in his 50s looking completely lost. His expensive suit was slightly wrinkled, and beads of sweat were forming on his forehead as he frantically checked his phone, which appeared to be dead. While most people rushed past him, caught up in their own morning routines, something made Sarah pause. Growing up, her grandmother had always taught her that helping others wasn't just the right thing to do, it was what made us human. "You never know someone's story until you take the time to listen," she would say. Those words echoed in Sarah's mind as she watched the man's growing frustration. Taking a deep breath, Sarah gathered her courage. In a city where people often warned kids about talking to strangers, she knew some might question her decision. But there was something about the genuine distress in the man's eyes that told her this was the right thing to do. "Excuse me, sir, are you looking for directions?" she asked, her voice clear and confident despite her initial nervousness. The man turned, surprise evident on his face as he looked down at the young girl in her neat school uniform, standing there with a warm smile. What happened next would become a story that would inspire thousands. The man, as it turned out, was Richard Thompson, one of the city's top corporate executives, who was running late for the most important meeting of his career. His phone had died, his driver had dropped him off at the wrong location, and in the confusion of construction detours, he had become completely disoriented. Sarah not only knew exactly where his office building was, she also knew a shortcut through a series of connected lobbies that would get him there in less than 10 minutes. But it wasn't just the directions she offered that would make this story remarkable. It was what she did next. "I can show you the way," she said, making a split-second decision that would mean being a few minutes late to school. The look of relief on Mr. Thompson's face was immediate, but he hesitated, clearly concerned about accepting help from a young stranger. What transpired during that short walk would challenge both their preconceptions and lead to a series of events that neither of them could have anticipated. Their conversation, though brief, would touch on themes of trust, judgment, and the invisible barriers we often put up between ourselves and others. As they navigated through the morning crowd, Sarah's grandmother's words about taking time to listen to others' stories proved more prophetic than she could have imagined. Because sometimes the biggest changes in our lives come from the smallest moments of connection, those precious instances when we choose to see past our differences and simply be human. But just as they were about to reach their destination, something happened that would turn this simple act of kindness into a story that would capture the hearts of millions. Mr. Thompson's reaction to Sarah's assistance would prove to be more than just a thank you. It would be a moment that would challenge how we think about generosity, prejudice, and the power of seeing the world through innocent eyes. Want to know what happened next? Stay tuned for the rest of this incredible true story that's reminding people everywhere that sometimes the most powerful changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. As they approached the towering glass building, Mr. Thompson checked his watch. He had exactly 7 minutes until his meeting, but something made him stop. In all his 25 years of corporate leadership, he'd never experienced such genuine kindness from a stranger, let alone from someone so young. The contrast between his morning's panic and this young girl's calm helpfulness struck him deeply. "Before you go," he said, reaching into his pocket, "I'd like to." But Sarah was already shaking her head. Her grandmother had always taught her that kindness wasn't a transaction. It was a gift you gave freely. The executive was visibly moved by her refusal of any reward, and that's when he noticed her school badge. It was from Carter Elementary, the same school his company was planning to cut funding from as part of a citywide budget restructuring. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was rushing to a meeting where he would discuss reducing support for underfunded schools, while being helped by one of the very students who would be affected. Sarah noticed his expression change as he looked at her badge, but she didn't understand why. Instead, she simply smiled and said, "You better hurry, sir. The elevator on the left is faster than the one on the right. She turned to leave, but Mr. Thompson called after her. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made Sarah pause. "Would you and your grandmother be willing to have lunch with me someday? There's something important I'd like to discuss." He pulled out his business card, wrote his personal number on the back, and handed it to her. Sarah accepted the card, puzzled by the serious tone that had replaced his earlier relief. As she walked away, she had no idea that her simple act of kindness was about to spark a chain of events that would affect not just her school, but the entire community. That evening, as Sarah shared the story with her grandmother over dinner, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had happened. Her grandmother listened intently, her wise eyes twinkling with understanding. "Sometimes," she said, stirring her tea thoughtfully, "the universe puts us exactly where we need to be." Meanwhile, across town, Mr. Thompson sat in his home office, the day's events playing over in his mind. The board meeting had gone differently than anyone had expected. Instead of discussing budget cuts, he had found himself standing up and sharing a story about a young girl who had reminded him of something he'd forgotten long ago. The next morning, whispers began circulating through the corporate offices. Something had changed during yesterday's meeting, but few knew the real story. The local news had somehow caught wind that a major announcement was coming, but nobody knew exactly what it was. Back at Carter Elementary, Sarah went about her normal routine, unaware that her small act of kindness had set wheels in motion that would soon turn her world upside down. As she sat in her classroom, struggling to focus on her math lesson, she couldn't stop thinking about the strange way Mr. Thompson had looked at her badge. That afternoon, as she walked home from school, she noticed more cars than usual parked outside the community center. There seemed to be an unusual buzz in the air, and people were gathering in small groups, talking excitedly about something. Even the local news van was parked nearby. Sarah clutched her backpack straps tighter, wondering what was going on. Just then, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was Mr. Thompson, and what he was about to tell her would leave her speechless. Want to find out what happens next? Stay tuned for the next part of this incredible story that proves how one small act of kindness can create ripples that change an entire community. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the message. "Your kindness opened my eyes. Could you and your grandmother meet me at the community center in an hour? There's something important you need to see." She rushed home to tell her grandmother, who seemed oddly unsurprised by the invitation, as if she had been expecting something like this all along. When they arrived at the community center, they were amazed to find the parking lot filled with cars. Local news vans were setting up their equipment, and a crowd had gathered near the entrance. Sarah recognized some of her teachers, classmates, and neighbors among the people waiting outside. As they approached the entrance, a familiar face emerged from the crowd. Mr. Thompson, looking much more relaxed than the day before, walked over to greet them. This time, instead of the confused and stressed executive Sarah had helped, she saw a man with purpose in his eyes and warmth in his smile. "Sarah," he said, kneeling down to meet her at eye level, "yesterday, you didn't just help me find my way to a meeting. You helped me find my way back to who I really am." He glanced at her grandmother, who nodded encouragingly. "You see, 30 years ago, I was a student at Carter Elementary too. Someone helped me back then, just like you helped me yesterday. I'd forgotten that until you reminded me." The buzz of the crowd grew louder as more people arrived. Through the community center's windows, Sarah could see that the main hall was packed. Camera crews were setting up their equipment, and important-looking people in suits were huddled in deep discussion. Mr. Thompson led Sarah and her grandmother through the crowd, sharing glances with other executives who seemed to be waiting for something. The anticipation in the room was electric. Sarah noticed her principal wiping away tears, though she was smiling broadly. What was going on? As they made their way to the front of the room, Sarah spotted a large covered display board on the stage. Next to it stood several members of the city council and what appeared to be the entire board of directors from Mr. Thompson's company. The mayor herself was there, beaming with barely contained excitement. Just then, Sarah's best friend rushed up to her, clutching a phone. "Sarah, you're trending. People are talking about you all over social media." Sarah's confusion deepened. How did people know about her helping Mr. Thompson? She hadn't told anyone except her grandmother. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, preparing to address the crowd. The room fell silent. He placed his hand on Sarah's shoulder and looked down at her with tears in his eyes. Yesterday, this young lady showed me what real community means. She reminded me that success isn't just about profits and budgets. It's about people. And now I have something to show her, and all of you, that will change everything. He reached for the cover on the display board, his hand pausing for a moment. The room held its collective breath. News cameras focused on the stage, reporters leaned forward with their microphones, and Sarah's heart pounded so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. What happened next would not only change Sarah's life forever, but would become a symbol of hope for communities across the country. As Mr. Thompson's hand gripped the cover, about to reveal what lay beneath, Sarah suddenly understood why her grandmother always said that kindness was the most powerful force in the world. Want to witness the moment that left an entire community speechless? Stay tuned for the incredible conclusion to this story that proves how one small act of kindness can spark a revolution of change. With dramatic flourish, Mr. Thompson pulled away the cover, revealing not one, but 3 display boards. The first showed architectural plans for a completely renovated Carter Elementary School. The second displayed a check for $5 million made out to the school district. But it was the third board that made Sarah's knees weak. A new community education initiative called the Sarah Project, aimed at providing full college scholarships to students who demonstrated exceptional character and community service. The room erupted in applause, but Mr. Thompson raised his hands for silence. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying a hint of something more. "There's something else you all need to know." The crowd hushed, sensing there was more to this story than they'd thought. He turned to Sarah's grandmother, who was now dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "would you please join us on stage?" As Sarah's grandmother made her way up, Mr. Thompson continued speaking. 30 years ago, when I was a struggling student at Carter Elementary, it wasn't just any teacher who helped me find my way. It was you." The revelation sent whispers rippling through the crowd. Sarah looked at her grandmother in astonishment. All these years of teaching her about kindness, and she'd never once mentioned this connection. Her grandmother's eyes twinkled with a mixture of pride and memories. But just as Mr. Thompson was about to elaborate, the back doors of the community center burst open. A group of people in business suits strode in, led by a stern-looking woman Sarah recognized from news coverage of corporate takeovers. The woman's heels clicked ominously against the floor as she approached the stage. "Richard," she called out, her voice cutting through the emotional atmosphere like ice. "The board hasn't approved this. You can't make these kinds of decisions unilaterally." The woman, Ms. Peterson, was the company's major stakeholder, known for prioritizing profits over community investment. The room fell silent as 2 competing visions for the future faced off. Mr. Thompson stood his ground, but Sarah could see worry lines creasing his forehead. Everything he just promised, the school renovation, the scholarships, all of it, hung in the balance. That's when Sarah's grandmother stepped forward, her small frame somehow filling the stage with quiet authority. She reached into her well-worn teacher's bag and pulled out a yellowed envelope. "Perhaps," she said, her voice clear and steady, "it's time to share what your former CEO wrote to me all those years ago." Ms. Peterson's confident expression faltered slightly. Mr. Thompson looked confused. Sarah held her breath. Whatever was in that envelope, her grandmother had kept it for 3 decades, waiting for exactly this moment. As her grandmother began to unfold the letter, Sarah noticed something else. Students from her school were streaming into the room, many holding their phones up, live streaming everything. What had started as a local story was quickly becoming something much bigger. The tension in the room was electric. Corporate power faced off against community spirit, with 30 years of history about to come to light. Sarah's simple act of kindness had unknowingly pulled back the curtain on a much larger story, one that would force everyone involved to question what really matters in building a successful future. Want to know what was in that mysterious letter? Stay tuned for the next part of this incredible story that shows how the past and present can collide to create an unexpected future. Mrs. Johnson's hands were steady as she unfolded the yellowed letter. The room fell silent, every person hanging on her next words. This letter, she began, was written by Thomas Peterson, the founder of this company, and Ms. Peterson's father, just weeks before he passed away. Ms. Peterson's stern expression softened slightly at the mention of her father's name. Her father had been known as a tough businessman, but also as someone who never forgot his roots. As Mrs. Johnson began reading, the words seemed to transport everyone back in time. "Dear Mrs. Johnson," she read, "you may not remember the day you found a struggling boy hiding in the school library during lunch. But that boy remembers. You didn't just help him with math that day. You showed him that he mattered. That boy was Richard Thompson, and today I'm entrusting him with my company because he has never forgotten what you taught him about the balance between success and compassion." Mr. Thompson's eyes widened in surprise. He had never known that his mentor had witnessed that long-ago interaction. Ms. Peterson stepped forward, her professional facade cracking as she heard her father's words continue. "To whoever leads this company in the future," Mrs. Johnson read on, "remember that our greatest asset isn't in our accounts, it's in our community. I've left a separate fund, untouchable by shareholders, dedicated to supporting initiatives that embody this principle. It only needs the signatures of both the CEO and my daughter to activate it." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Ms. Peterson reached for the letter with trembling hands, recognizing her father's handwriting. "Dad never told me about this fund," she whispered, then looked up at Mr. Thompson with new understanding. Sarah watched as these powerful adults, who had seemed so intimidating moments before, were transformed by the weight of this shared history. But there was more. Her grandmother wasn't finished. "There's something else," Mrs. Johnson said, pulling out a second page. "The fund's first activation requires a nomination from a student who demonstrates the values this company was built on. In 30 years, I've never found the right moment or the right student. Until now." Every eye in the room turned to Sarah, who suddenly understood why her grandmother had always insisted on teaching her about kindness. She hadn't just been passing on life lessons. She'd been preparing her for this moment. Mr. Thompson and Ms. Peterson looked at each other, years of corporate rivalry melting away as they recognized their shared connection to the company's founding principles. Together, they approached the podium. "The Sarah Project will be just the beginning," Ms. Peterson announced, her voice strong with newfound purpose. "Today, we're not just honoring one act of kindness, we're returning to our company's true mission." But as the room erupted in celebration, Sarah noticed something that stopped her heart for a moment. On the back of the letter her grandmother held, there was a handwritten note that no one else had seen yet. She caught a glimpse of today's date written 30 years ago, and below it, words that would add one final twist to this extraordinary story. Want to discover what message from the past could possibly add another layer to this already incredible story? Stay tuned for the final revelation that will leave you questioning whether some things in life are more than just coincidence. Sarah's hands trembled as she gently took the letter from her grandmother. The handwritten note on the back read, "To be opened on a day when kindness comes full circle." Below it was today's date, written 3 decades ago. But what made Sarah's breath catch was the small sketch in the corner. A simple drawing of 2 people at a crossroads, eerily similar to where she had met Mr. Thompson. The crowd gathered around as Sarah showed the note to Mr. Thompson and Ms. Peterson. The room fell quiet once again. Ms. Peterson touched the sketch with gentle fingers, recognition flickering in her eyes. "My father used to draw these little scenes," she said softly. "He believed that the most important moments in life happen at crossroads, both literal and metaphorical." Mr. Thompson shook his head in amazement. "All these years, working in the company he built, I thought I was following his business legacy. But this," he gestured to the letter, the sketch, and the room full of community members. "This was the real legacy he wanted us to continue." The Sarah Project launched the very next day, but it grew into something far bigger than anyone had imagined. The story of 3 generations connected by simple acts of kindness, from Mrs. Johnson helping young Richard, to Sarah helping Mr. Thompson, to the company returning to its community-focused roots, sparked a movement that spread well beyond their city. 1 year later, Carter Elementary had been transformed into a state-of-the-art school with a special emphasis on community service. The scholarship program had already helped dozens of students, and similar initiatives were sprouting up in cities across the country. But perhaps the most remarkable change was the one that happened in the corporate world. Ms. Peterson and Mr. Thompson became partners in reshaping how businesses interact with their communities. Their story became a case study in how profit and purpose could work hand in hand. As for Sarah, she learned something profound about her grandmother's wisdom. Those daily lessons in kindness hadn't just been about being nice to others. They were about being ready for moments that could change lives. Her grandmother had held onto that letter for 30 years, waiting for the perfect moment when past, present, and future would align. On the anniversary of that fateful day, Sarah stood again at the intersection where she had helped Mr. Thompson. A commemorative plaque had been placed there, but that wasn't why she came. She came to watch the morning crowd, knowing that somewhere in that rush of people, another moment of kindness was waiting to happen. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Kindness isn't just an action. It's a bridge between strangers, a light in darkness, and sometimes a message sent from the past to the future. Sarah understood now that her simple decision to help a lost stranger hadn't just changed her life or her community. It had unleashed a wave of positive change that continued to grow. As she turned to leave, she saw a young student looking lost, much like Mr. Thompson had been that day. Sarah smiled, knowing that this wasn't just history repeating itself. It was hope taking a new form. She approached the student, ready to pass on the legacy that her grandmother had entrusted to her. Because sometimes the smallest choices we make can unlock doors we never knew existed, connecting past, present, and future in ways we could never imagine. And in those moments, we discover that kindness isn't just about helping others. It's about keeping alive a legacy of hope that spans generations. After all, the most powerful stories aren't just the ones that end well. They're the ones that inspire others to begin their own chapters of positive change.